In an era where the global population growth is high and climate change continues to reshape our environment, the question of how we produce, distribute, and consume food has never been more critical. Food systems are at the heart of this challenge, impacting not only our health, but also the sustainability of our planet. As we dive into this topic today, we will explore how different stakeholders are navigating these issues and what needs to change to ensure that food systems are resilient. Joining me today is Mr. IGIHE, a veteran journalist and a financial communications expert. Abi, thank you for making time to speak to us.
Thank you, Sam, for having me. Well, it's a pleasure to be here on IGIHE, and I have been in the financial communications industry for the last 15 years, and it has been an exciting journey coming up with stories that are impacting communities, and not only communities, but also our audiences spread across the world. And I come here with an open mind to engage and just bring out these critical conversations that are shaping Africa, and Africa must speak for itself and be counted by being on the table.
It's my pleasure to have you. Let's straight away dive into the conversation. You will agree with me that Africa has the potential to sustain its food security, but we cannot ignore the fact that there are some other external factors that influence the process, such as climate change. What do you think is the mitigating factor that brings these together?
Well, Sam, you have set the tone indeed for this conversation. And when you look at Africa as a continent, it is the continent that they say is the continent of the future. 60% of the global arable land lies in Africa, and yet 20% of Africans every year go hungry. This is quite unfortunate for such a rich continent, but yet so poor when it comes to feeding its population. And when you look at the food crisis right now, it is quite appalling. We are seeing heavy, unprecedented climate change facing Africa. We are seeing youth unemployment becoming a big issue right now. We're also seeing urbanization that is impacting various cities across Africa. And at the end of the day, Africa can rise up to the occasion and be able to address these challenges. It just requires the political will and the private sector to also play a proactive role in this, Sam.
Well, looking at some of the challenges and the effects of climate change and some of the interventions that are made by individual governments, it seems the journey has just begun.
Clearly, when I race back to time, I remember the Abuja Declaration where African leaders agreed that 15% of their budgets should be going towards financing the agriculture sector. And this seems to not have happened. And it has affected many countries to date. As we speak right now, a number of countries are facing a very dire situation when it comes to food. A number of countries are importing food in Africa. To give you this picture, we saw countries in Southern Africa, like Zambia. They're facing a very tumultuous time when it comes to feeding its population. We are not just seeing that alone. There are other countries such as Kenya, which is also in a crisis when you're looking at what the drought did to the country, as well as the floods that came up early in the year. And all this tells you that climate change is becoming a very major impacting abnormality that is facing countries right now. Climate change is no longer a distant issue. It is becoming a more present issue. And we are seeing the situation is likely to get worse with global temperatures continuing to rise. And this will have far-reaching effects when it comes to seeing countries facing challenges with malnutrition, countries facing challenges with protests because populations feel that they are not getting food at the right price. We've seen the conflicts that are happening in the Sahel region. The conflict happening right now has had profound effects on food supply chains. And this is a very critical juncture, and there has to be urgent action if Africa is to be able to address all these issues. We were together at a very important forum just a few weeks ago, and many leaders are of the view that the time for Africa to fix its situation is now and not tomorrow. Action has to come now.
Actually, talk about that forum. It is the Africa Food Systems Summit that was hosted in Kigali just a few days ago. Some of the resolutions that came to table is that there has to be a collective and innovative approach towards sustaining the food security. But if you look at the capacity of some of our African countries and what they have probably put in their budgets to meet such demands, do you think we are doing good enough?
When you sit with some of the experts, they say Africa is far from attaining its goals. When you look at, for example, funding of SMEs in agriculture, there is a $42 billion gap that needs to be bridged. When you look at the current state of affairs, African countries are literally in a situation where a lot of investment is required to be able to help agricultural value chains become more mechanized, because the populations are growing at a high pace, and you cannot rely on subsistence farming that we used to practice from time immemorial. There has to be a mind shift. There has to be a new paradigm where governments, private sector, collectively work in unison, especially when it comes to investing in the right infrastructure. A number of farmers, these are the small-scale farmers, they do not have proper infrastructure. For instance, farmers who are in dairy sector, they do not have the requisite infrastructure for the cooling of their milk. We are seeing farmers who are also experiencing challenges such as post-harvest losses, where 40% of all harvests in many countries in Africa are lost due to post-harvest losses. And this is a question of equipping farmers with the right capacity, from having the storage where they can store their grains, and also preserving this harvest. Because when the harvest is not preserved and it's lost due to post-harvest losses, it erodes the gains of the farmers. And this is an area that a lot of work needs to be done when it comes to streamlining the gaps in the agricultural value chains. Another key issue is the fact that the value chains also require a lot of technology to be infused, because we are looking at feeding a population that is growing. We're standing at about almost 1 billion plus Africans. And it is projected that the numbers will rise by 2050 to more than almost 1.5 billion people. And this is a moment in history that Africa can seize by being able to adopt innovative agricultural practices, where there's a lot of talk around using different seed varieties to boost their yields. There's talk of using drones in some of the farms across the continent. And we've seen some innovative entrepreneurs coming on board. Some companies are willing to work with African countries, especially when it comes to helping them transition to being able to use innovative ways to be able to grow their productivity. So when I sit back and I look at some of these situations, it leaves me quite left with a lot of thoughts in my mind, especially when it comes to Africa countries being able to feed the continent, because Africa has the capacity to feed itself, and not only that, but also feed the global community.
Such policies are made through meetings and summits, just like the one that recently happened in Kigali. But if we think about such high-profile meetings and waiting for them to take decisions that affect the common person, sometimes it might take too long, or sometimes people don't have the right information that will guide their decisions. But still, I think as an individual, you and I and you, the viewer, someone has something as an individual that you can do to contribute towards this. Is that correct?
Very spot on, because it all starts with what initiatives have we as people taken in terms of feeding the growing population. Right now, as it stands, we have seen quite a number of people being interested in agriculture in Africa. When I sat down with some of the key experts that were attending this summit, they would share some interesting statistics, citing, for example, that Africa has a very fragmented agricultural value chain. By this I mean we have people who are taking agriculture as not as a business, but as a means to be able to survive in the city, where you find Sam or Abby, you're living in Kigali, you have a piece of land, let's say outside Kigali. How can you make productive use of it? How can you, in one way or the other, come up with your home kitchen garden that will be able to substitute what you're doing in terms of buying your daily consumables? But experts also argue that this is not the way to do agriculture. Agriculture should be left to those who have the expertise and the technical capacity. Because when you look at developed economies across the world, you see farmers are among the highest earners. For example, in the USA, farmers are among the biggest entrepreneurs. The same does not apply in Africa. And Africans, we have to ask ourselves, how can we tackle this situation, especially when it comes to playing your role at your individual level, and at the same time, how can governments step in and incentivize people to go into farming? Because farming has money, but at the same time, farming is very risky. Because it's one thing to do your planting, it's another thing to harvest. We are in a situation where we are seeing unprecedented weather patterns that are affecting our productivity. We're also seeing urbanization, which is eating up arable land in many urban cities. But there has to be a high-level policy level where they can say we have to zone out different parts of the country to be for agricultural farming, and we also incentivize small-scale farmers. We graduate them to become medium-scale to large-scale farmers, and clearly showing that farming can actually be an enterprise that people can venture into. Because when you look at the average age of a farmer in Africa, it is 53 years old. That is an average farmer. Both you and I, we are not yet 53. I am not into farming. I don't know about you. Are you into farming?
Yeah, sometimes, sometimes though I am not yet fully involved into it, but it's actually on my radar. It's one of the options I am exploring on a large scale.
Excellent. So imagine for you to have or to become a farmer, you need to have access to an asset, and the asset is the land. How many people are able to buy land for farming? How many people have land, but they don't have the means to do farming? They do not have the equipment. They do not have the car to transport their produce to the markets. And once they get it to the market, do you get assurance that your commodities will be bought? So those are the hard critical issues that people must tackle right now, especially at policy level. Because we are seeing a lot of opportunity to grow trade in Africa, especially now that we are talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is a mechanism that can unlock enormous potential in Africa. It is proposed that if Africa can be able to trade with itself and reduce the barriers to trade, their continent can raise the intra-Africa trade from 17% to 40%. And this will be a game changer, because Africa will not only be able to be a formidable force, but it will also be able to feed itself and cut its reliance on imports. We are seeing what the conflict in the Ukraine and Russia has had on wheat in Africa. And this is just one of the examples. And the escalating geopolitical tensions are continuing to impact the agricultural value chains. So it is high time that Africa really resets and says, we want to say, this is how we want to transform our food systems. And I liked what some of the key speakers, including Dr. Kalibata, mentioned, that we are at a critical point where we must take urgent action, or else we will be in a dilemma if this is not tackled.
Well, I have also seen reports indicating that from the other year, before this summit, the summit before, around over 10 billion US dollars was actually generated in terms of food security investment opportunities. So it's very clear that then there is a direct link between food security, economics, and security itself. Mm-hmm. Because from the example that you've given about Ukraine and Russia, when the war broke out, all prices rose. So from that perspective, do you think as Africa, we are on the right track?
Well, that's a difficult question, Sam, to respond to, but I'll try to my level best, because when I look at the existential threat that faces the continent, it is quite immense. When you see the number of investors who were in Rwanda during the Africa Food Systems Summit, it is testament that people are interested in the continent. We saw over 97 countries
represented.
Yes. And
over 5,000 participants.
Exactly.
Yes.
When you see this, it tells you that people are really keen to engage with Africa. How are African entrepreneurs positioning their businesses to be able to attract this foreign direct investment? Because as it stands right now, we're having many great ideas, but they are not bankable. We need to see more young entrepreneurs, women, being able to generate bankable ideas that if they get the financing, they are able to implement this. And there's a lot of scope, especially in the value chains that are around processing, because not everybody can be out in the farm and do the farming in the field. Yeah. We also need another layer of experts or people who can play at a different level, especially when it comes to supplies and, of course, processing. Because when you're looking at the African population, it is growing at an exponential rate, and there'll be a very huge demand for processed foods into the future. And this is an excellent opportunity. And when you see the situation around Ukraine and Russia, wheat prices increased by over 20% by just the action of that conflict. And that is just one of the examples that we are seeing, that we're looking at Sudan right now. There are tensions, and this is also likely to impact the production of some of the food items. Mm-hmm. We are looking at Northern Africa, Central Africa. There's a bit of instability in that region. And these are some of the countries that are big producers from various products, from cocoa, rice, palm oil, to name but a few. So clearly the link between regional stability and food production and climate change is a triple crisis that must be addressed at the highest level, including the African Union. Because when we see escalating tensions, this technically means farming comes to a halt. When you see tensions along the Red Sea, this impacts on the waterways that some of these vessels carrying this produce usually pass. And it is quite a moment in history that African leaders must speak with one voice, and there has to be unity and collective action, especially when it comes to streamlining and ensuring that there is one focus and one goal.
Wow, what a moment to reflect. Well, Abi, another thing, if you look at the statistics that are available, especially in Africa, most people who are engaged in agriculture are women. Those who have machinery or those who have modern equipment to help in the agriculture, yes, some will be men, but on the subsistence level or on the local level in most of these countries across Africa, it's the women mostly that are involved in this agriculture. Yet, if you look at areas where there is some insecurity in the region, in the neighboring countries where insecurity is high, or even in other countries, you find still it's the women that suffer the most. Now, today, when there is hunger or when there is famine or something has not gone well in terms of food security, it is still the women and the young children who will suffer. I think there should be a deliberate plan to empower women so that they can keep surviving through all these stages.
That is a very hot issue right now, and it is an area that has elicited a lot of reactions from across the globe and also across the continent. Because when you look at the gender gap, it is quite an area that there has to be a rethink around it. Women are not only bearing the brunt of the disruptions in the food systems. Women are the first frontline people that get affected, and then the children. We are looking at an opportunity right now where we have women-focused funds that can help women drive investments in agriculture. And this is an opportune moment really for international actors and development finance institutions that can step in and bridge the gap. Because when women are not prioritized, you can clearly feel the impact at the household level. And this is an area that we are seeing a number of countries must address this, especially when it comes to setting up the right financial institutions. We've seen a lot of interests from various multiple actors, including the likes of IGIHE International. We've seen the likes of IFAD coming in. And this is just a couple of entities that are really putting in a lot of work in the continent, but also there has to be interventions from our local governments, because it is one thing to rely heavily on donor funding. It's another thing when the donor funding dries up. And this is really an area that I feel there has to be more and deeper conversations that go beyond this show to even other boardrooms and, of course, even at the highest level, including the United Nations.
Yeah. Well, Abi, our time is fast spent, but I want to pick one last opinion from you about how safe you think it is to involve, to hold, for example, the food system struggle or journey as an independent country or as an individual country, other than just collectively being with others. Rwanda, for example, has also definitely put in some efforts in regard to this. There are some policies that are existing as a country alone. But do you think this is just enough? Because as a country, you cannot, this is a global crisis. So however much you put in a lot of effort as a country, I still think there is much more. Probably there is something more than just an individual.
Well, in my closing thoughts on this issue is that this is a moment for African countries to witness a rebirth where African countries can simply say, how do we collaborate? How do we partner? Because one of the key themes for this year's Africa Food Systems was how to enhance collaborations between countries and, of course, build sufficient capacity to ensure that countries are able to stand on their feet, and at the same time, where there are gaps, another country can step in. And this can only be implemented through political will by the leaders who are willing to work with each other. There are, of course, geopolitical issues that are at play as we speak, but it will be prudent on the African leadership to really look at how best can Africa work with itself to avert this food crisis that threatens not only to wipe out the GDP of many economies, but also is a ticking time bomb if not addressed.
Well, Abi, thank you so much for creating time. The insights you've given us are very valuable and useful. They are important to me personally. They are also important to our audience. And you, the viewer, this is one of the many topics or discussions or conversations that we shall be bringing up to you. Feel free to join us, join the conversation on our platforms. Thank you so much from us. Until then, bye-bye.